quiet whisper filled the house as Peppa and George played in their room. Mummy Pig was cooking in the kitchen, and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Suddenly, George's old teddy bear, forgotten in the corner, began to twitch strangely. Its eyes, usually empty, now glowed with a dim red light. Peppa felt a slight chill run down her spine. George, noticing nothing, reached for the toy. Mummy Pig hummed, paying no attention to the quiet rustling. Daddy Pig turned a page of the newspaper, his gaze fixed on the text. The bear slowly rose, its paws creaking on the floor. Peppa wrinkled, her eyes wide with horror. George was still reaching for the toy, his face blank. Mummy Pig put the kettle on, steam filling the kitchen. Daddy Pig yawned, his attention completely absorbed by the newspaper. The bear moved towards George, its red eyes burning brighter. Peppa tried to scream, but her voice was stuck in her throat. George grabbed the bear and his body began to shake. Mummy Pig poured the tea, her movements mechanical. Daddy Pig folded the newspaper, his face indifferent. The bear hugged George, and they both began to slowly dissolve into the air. Peppa stood alone, her heart pounding wildly. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig continued with their chores, as if nothing had happened. An emptiness filled the room where George and the bear had just been. Peppa closed her eyes, trying to forget what she had seen, but the whisper remained, and it was getting louder. The morning in Peppa Pig's house began as usual. The sun streamed through the curtains, illuminating the bunk bed where George peacefully slept on the bottom and Peppa on the top. Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Everything was familiar and calm. Peppa came downstairs greeting her parents, but George, usually so cheerful, remained in his bed, covered by a blanket. Mummy Pig approached him, trying to wake him up, but he just turned away, whimpering softly. "George, it's time for breakfast," she said gently. But George didn't react. His usually clear laughter was replaced by some strange, muffled mumbling. Peppa tried to play with him, but he just pushed her toy away. His eyes, usually full of mischief, now seemed empty and distant. He started spending more and more time in his room, avoiding games and communication. Even his favorite muddy puddles no longer interested him. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were worried. They tried to talk to him, but George only answered monosyllabically or remained silent altogether. His voice became lower and his movements slowed down. One evening, as Peppa was trying to put him to bed, George suddenly said, "They are coming for everyone." Peppa was scared, but George just turned to the wall. The next day, when Susie Sheep came to visit, George didn't come out to meet her. Peppa went to his room and saw George sitting on the floor, staring blankly. His skin seemed paler than usual, and there were no emotions on his face. "George, what's wrong with you?" Peppa asked. He slowly raised his head, and Peppa saw that his eyes had turned completely black. "We are waiting," he whispered, in a voice that wasn't George's. Peppa ran out of the room in horror. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig rushed to her. "What happened, Peppa?" Mummy Pig asked. Peppa, gasping, told them about George. Daddy Pig went into George's room but returned with empty eyes. "He's just sleeping," he said, but his voice was strangely monotonous. Peppa looked at her parents. Their faces were devoid of all emotion, and their eyes seemed as empty as George's. She realized that they had changed too. Peppa was left alone in the house where laughter and joy once reigned. Now there was only silence and cold. She looked out the window. Beyond it stretched a world that seemed as alien and lifeless as her family. Peppa felt something inside her beginning to change. The cold slowly filled her, pushing out all emotions. Her eyes began to darken. She no longer felt fear, only emptiness and waiting for what would come for her and for everyone else. A sunny day illuminated Peppa Pig's house, but strange tension hung in the air. Peppa sat at a new computer in her room, the screen flickering with blue light. "Oh, what an interesting game about spiders." George peered over his sister's shoulder, his eyes widening with surprise. A red and blue masked spider character appeared on screen. "Peppa, he looks scary." Mummy Pig was climbing the stairs with a cup of tea, but stopped hearing strange sounds from the room. The computer emitted a low humming, and when the screen began to flicker. "Children, what's happening there?" Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper downstairs when the house lights began to flicker. He looked up and frowned, hearing electrical crackling from above. "This is very strange for an ordinary day." Peppa pressed a key and suddenly a dark, sticky mass emerged from the screen. It slowly spread across the desk, making hissing sounds. "George, get away from the computer." George stepped back, but the dark substance was already beginning to take shape. It grew and pulsated, forming a toothy grin and white eyes. "This is not a toy, Peppa." Mummy Pig rushed into the room and saw the dark mass enveloping the computer. Her face paled with horror. The cup fell from her hooves. "Children, leave the room immediately." Daddy Pig heard the scream and rushed upstairs, his heavy steps thundering on the stairs. Chaos reigned in the room. Furniture moved by itself. "What the devil is going on here?" The dark mass completely consumed the computer and began to grow, filling the corners of the room. The Pig family pressed against the wall, watching the unfolding nightmare. "We must get out of here." Suddenly, a red and blue figure swung through the window on a web, landing between the family and the dark threat. Spider-Man, in Peppa's style, looked determined. "Don't be afraid, I'll help you." An epic battle began between Spider-Man and the dark entity, furniture flying around the room. The Pig family watched as good fought evil right in their home. "Be careful, little spider." Spider-Man wrapped the dark mass in webbing and dragged it back into the computer, which exploded in a bright flash. The room filled with silence. Only burnt wires remained on the desk. Computer games can be dangerous, remember that? Peppa lay on the top bunk of her bunk bed, listening to George tossing and turning below. His breathing was erratic, unusually heavy for a sleeping child. She tried to sleep, but the unease grew with every strange rustle from beneath her. Morning brought only more questions. At breakfast, George sat staring at his bowl of porridge, his gaze empty and detached. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig exchanged glances, their smiles gone, replaced by a slight anxiety. Peppa tried to talk to George, but he didn't answer, only shaking his head slightly. At the playground, George sat in the sandbox, his small hands mechanically sifting sand, but his eyes remained lifeless. He didn't respond to Peppa's calls, to her attempts to engage him in play. In the evening, as her parents discussed his strange behavior, George sat in the corner of the room, engrossed in drawing. Peppa came closer and saw that he was sketching strange, repetitive symbols on paper. Circles, triangles, squares. They were perfectly even, almost mechanical. Peppa's anxiety intensified. She tried to show the drawings to her parents, but they were too busy with their own affairs, dismissing her. The next day, Susie Sheep came to play. George sat next to her, but his eyes were empty, and he didn't participate in their games. Susie looked confused and a little scared. Peppa looked at George, and it seemed to her that he was looking directly at her, but without any expression, as if through her. Later, when Peppa tried to talk to Susie about George, she also seemed detached, her gaze as empty as George's. Peppa felt the world around her begin to change. At the playground, she saw that other children, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, were also sitting with the same empty, detached stares. It was like a silent epidemic. Peppa walked home, feeling completely alone and frightened. The sky was overcast with grey clouds, and the house seemed alien. Entering the living room, she saw Mummy and Daddy sitting on the couch. They were watching television, but their eyes were as empty as George's and the other children's. Peppa tried to reach out to them, but they didn't respond. Their faces were lifeless masks. Peppa ran to her room. She sat on the floor, surrounded by George's drawings, which now seemed like ominous omens. The room plunged into darkness, and Peppa felt despair engulf her. She fell asleep, but sleep brought no relief. She dreamed of shadows in red suits.